Well, hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Simple Business Stewardship. I'm Lauren Rilling, your fractional CFO. And with me today, I am very honored to have Eva Daniel. She is a former speechwriter for some of the top speakers in the country. And she is also now a speech coach. And what I love about Eva is that she is all about both the style and the substance. She knows content and she knows how to deliver that content. So it's really incredible. And so I love that you're able to bring the two together to create something really amazing. Eva, thank you for being here today with me. It's so much fun.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so fun to connect with you here. We talk, people should know we talk all the time offline, back and forth. And so it's fun to get to do this here.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to dive in because I mean, you guys probably know by now, if you haven't done this already, but then you need to sign up for my master class because it's going to be next Thursday. So instead of having a simple business stewardship, we're doing the master class and it's on how to scale your profit this year in 2023, even with this crazy economic climate. And so that link is in the comments below. But, selfishly, I'm like gleaning so much from what Eva is going to be sharing today. And I was coming up with my questions. I'm like, I need to know this because I'm going to be doing this masterclass next week. And so Eva's going to be helping me, not just by coming on the show, but by
This
also
is
by
live
giving
coaching.
all of her great advice. So Eva, okay, let's start with this. So it seems like when it comes to speaking, especially, with entrepreneurs and, we're all here on LinkedIn, we're all trying to network, promote our own brands, all of that good stuff. But it's like some people seem to just have this it factor. So are great speakers born or are great speakers made?
Great speakers are definitely made. I mean, I do have 4 kids, and so some of them I swear did come out of the womb talking, and others of them it felt like it took 2 or 3 years. So some of us are just naturally maybe more extroverted, or where we are just naturally it's easy for us, or it's a little bit more enjoyable. But every single person gets better through practice. I was so impressed. You mentioned that I was an entrepreneur. Before that, I was a speechwriter for Dave Ramsey. And for those, I'm sure in your audience are pretty familiar with Dave, but for those who aren't, he has a very popular personal finance radio program and curriculums on personal finance and a professional speaker. And he's been speaking for decades. And he still spends hours and hours practicing his new content, learning the content, running it through, practicing, iterating on humor, iterating on the stories, making sure the slides match. So much of when we see someone on a stage and we think, oh, they're incredible, or even maybe in a small conference room of someone we see presenting to 5 of us that just seems really charismatic and dynamic. A lot of times it is because they've spent the time to practice, to learn their content, and to make sure that their content is good. A lot of times people struggle, they think their struggle might be with that delivery side, but it's actually, I find very frequently, it's that they're not really clear in what they're even trying to say and that content side.
Okay. So you really have to have both then and make sure that you have both the content. The content has to be solid first because then no matter how well you deliver it, if it's bad content, it's just not going to come across well. But at the same time, if you have great content and you aren't the way that you're communicating it isn't exciting and memorable, then it can fall flat and not really have the impact that it could. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. I always say that, content and delivery are 2 sides of the same coin. Ideally, you're going to have both and you're going to work on both so that they're both great.
And sometimes I feel like when you're the one who's writing it and delivering it yourself, it's like you can't see outside of your own frame. But like Eva is able to come in and go, I know exactly what's going on. Like your content, here's how we can, spruce this up. but then here's what you can do to make that real content delivery really impactful. And I feel like sometimes, when it's we all really need that outside perspective of having someone else to say to us, here's where your content could use some work. Here's where your content delivery really needs some work, because otherwise it's just an echo chamber, right? So we really need the outside perspective and someone to help us discern what's really going on, and why maybe isn't our speech getting across in the way that we really want it to. So I love that sometimes we think it's one thing, but it really could be the content, it really could be something else.
Well, and to your
um,
point, what you were just saying, I mean, yes, I do that professionally where I come in and tell people, hey, your 17 to 20-minute mark is really dry. You need some humor, maybe something like this. But even if you're not in a position where you'd be hiring someone to help you on your content, every single person before you present, you can run that through content by someone before you actually deliver it in front of a group. And by someone, I don't mean to yourself in the mirror. And I also don't necessarily mean to your spouse or even somebody that's like so enmeshed in the similar content as you, like maybe the direct person you worked with, but someone else asks somebody, hey, would you have 30 minutes for me to run through this presentation for you to give me feedback? Just so you can, it one helps you on your nerves later on. So it kind of can help you run through that content and clarify the own content in your head. And it also helps you kind of figure out what are the points that maybe are confusing to the audience based on the feedback that they gave me. So anyone can start doing that is before you're going to be giving a presentation or a pitch or something like that, just running it through someone else to get an extra set of ears on it.
Oh, that's really good. That's really good because I feel like it's one thing to just practice, and like practicing in front of the mirror is good. Even like I've heard you say like even videotaping yourself and playing it back, which is a kind of a scary thing to do, but really like having someone with fresh eyes, like they don't even have to be an expert necessarily, but just someone with fresh eyes is can be so valuable, and it's certainly worth doing anytime you're gonna try to communicate something that is important that you've like worked on. So that is a really good tip. What do you find are like just the common mistakes that you see entrepreneurs make? Like, we see like the Dave Ramseys of the world speaking. But then what about people who are aspiring to be speakers? Maybe they, started a business and they have a particular niche or a particular point of view, and they really want to use speaking to um, just get their message out to build their brand. Maybe they're speaking online. Maybe it's not even, we're all online. We all have access to a platform, right? So being on video a lot more is really a lot more common. And I know a lot of business owners are trying to step up their game with being on social media, maybe doing live streams like this, offering video webinars. So whether that is like an in-person, traditional sort of speaking format or in an online format, what are some of the mistakes that you see people make? Because speaking in a way that is not bringing forth that charisma and that authority, that can actually hurt your brand more than it can help, right? So we don't want to do that. So what are the things that we need to really be mindful of and watch out for?
One of the things I think is to really lean into your own story and your own authenticity. I think a lot of times, we model our speaking off of other people and instead of really thinking through, hey, what do I think about this? What are my stories about this? Stories are what really resonates with people. And often I see that on content when I'm working with, business leaders of companies, is they have too much content that they're trying to relay. And if you have too much content and you haven't done that ruthlessly eliminating anything that doesn't point towards your main point and really clarified what is this presentation about, you're going to find yourself stumbling over the content, and also you're going to find yourself talking really fast and then maybe not really expanding out and letting your humor breathe or your stories breathe. I think also we somehow have this thing within us where, especially as small business leaders, we like to talk about our successes and the things that we did really well. But honestly, it's a lot of those failure stories that really are going to become more engaging and have people identify with you. I love there's Dave Ramsey has a quote that success is just a pile of failures that you're standing on top of. And I think that that's such a good reminder to all of us that in this entrepreneurial small business journey, we're all learning and we're making mistakes and really sharing those in real time. And that doesn't discredit, I think some people worry that that's going to discredit their thought leadership, but it actually cracks open the door of authenticity if you place a couple of those really well. I think a lot of times too, some of the mistakes people make really are terrible at telling stories. We have this tendency when it comes to telling stories to tell them very linear. A happened, and then B happened, and then C happened. And we tell stories in this very linear fashion. But all of my favorite movies, when you sit down in the movie theater, which full confession, I don't do as much now with 4 kids. It's more of like watching a movie at home. But when I'm sitting down watching a movie, it starts right in on the action most of the time. You start in the middle of the scene and you're a little confused, but then as the scene goes on, it makes sense. Well, that same principle can translate to the way that we tell stories of let's dive in with the action and then we'll backtrack the details that are important. But really questioning, where am I starting this story? Am I starting at the best spot? And really branching out that story to pull in some of the, like, what did you feel and what did you think when it happened? Because even in our own storytelling, we tend to go very factual. This happened and then this happened, this happened. But when those things happen, how did it make you feel and what did it make you think? And so pulling in that dimension. And then since you mentioned social media, not just, speeches and presentations, but how are we showing up other places as well? A lot of it is just looking for brand consistency. The way you say something in a speech or presentation should also kind of be the way that you talk online. A lot of times when you go to writing, we kind of bring this formal version of us into our writing without bringing that like friendly side. So going through the check is like, is this the way that I would say it to someone else? If I was having a conversation rather than having written this piece of content, would I say it this way? And so really just kind of running things through that check mark of being conversational. It's like, is this the way that I would actually say it? Because that breeds authenticity if you say it the way that you would say it, rather than like, oh, it would sound better if I said it this way. But how do you speak? And is that the way that you're showing up in multiple platforms?
Okay, that makes sense. So instead of going into like, this is how I need to talk on social media, or this is how I need to sound in a speech, making sure that you really sound like yourself across, like, no matter where you are in whatever context. And then more stories, but less content at the same time. Like, really focus your content and edit out where it's just like too wide and try to go deeper with your content instead of wider with your content, and then tell your stories in a more interesting way than just to make it first, second, first, next, and then finally this happened. And if we can bring those elements together, then that sounds like it would be a winning combination.
Yes, and it sounds a little overwhelming and like a lot, but I always say, constructing a speech, if you just have like a simple framework, and if you want, I can run through a framework I use just with clients that can
Yeah,
be
yeah,
helpful.
that was awesome.
So, and
Run
this
through your
can actually
framework.
work. This can also work with your social media or LinkedIn posts, or it can work with other written content as well. But this is kind of when I played around and developed a little bit. So first, it's a five step structure, and the first is just attention. On LinkedIn, we call that your hook. What is your hook for your talk? What is the attention? So, what is that thing that's going to be that instantly interesting? Oftentimes, that can be a story. Sometimes it's a startling stat. Sometimes it's a joke. Oftentimes, it's not a joke if you're not naturally funny. I actually posted about that this morning. Sometimes it can be an interesting quote. I like stories a lot to kind of get people interested, but start with attention. What's going to grab their attention? And then talk a little bit about the problem. What problem is your presentation or your speech or your social media post solving? What is the problem that you see? A lot of times we want to just rush to the solutions that we have, and we don't really make the people listening to us or reading our content want to know the solution. We just kind of brush aside really quick. So, really distilling down what that problem is. And then you give them the solution. And depending on how much time you have, will vary of how many solutions you have. And then after you give the solution, give a call to action. What do you want them to do with what they have heard? A lot of times, because it's so clear to us what we want them to do with what they've heard, we think it's just going to be naturally intuitive. But you actually need to tell them, what was the point of the stories you told, or what was the point of doing the solution, and what do you want them to do with it? Ideally, if you can give people both a short term and a long term action to apply, that can be really effective. A short term action is just a quick win that they can have. Maybe they pull out their phone and they text someone, or they write something down in their notes app, or they click on a link, or they order the book. Something just is so easily accessible. And then the longer term would be, what is the longer term application of something they could do if they followed your principles and advice and your solutions? And then finally, how are you closing this thing to be interesting? A lot of times, especially in presentations or speeches, I mean, I think we've all seen people just kind of trail off at the end, right? Where they've had this really engaging presentation and then the end is just kind of flat, or maybe it ends on Q&A and the last question someone asked is really weird and it doesn't even make sense to the topic or whatever the thing is. But really having an intentionality behind your close of what is an interesting story or something that I can leave them with to really make an impact with what I've shared.
So you would not recommend ending with Q&A?
No, that's one of my hot takes.
Oh, okay.
I have a few hot takes, and this is one of them. So Q&A is wonderful, and you should take Q&A, especially depending on your topic, because Q&A was such a great way to have audience participation, and it can bring clarity to your message. So Q&A is a great thing. But if you end your whole presentation on Q&A, you have essentially given over the control of the final impression of your content to the last question asker. And I mean, I'm sure Lauren, you've had this experience where people are popping up with their questions and some of them you're like, oh my gosh, I was thinking of asking that. Oh, I'm so glad that person asked it. But it feels like there's always
Mhm.
that one person in any Q&A that they have a question that's unrelated to their content. It doesn't even make sense. It's totally off base or not on topic. And you don't know what questions are coming. And sometimes just because of the time you might have to end on that question. So I encourage people to kind of set right before you're going into Q&A. This is when you're an individual presenter. Right before you're going into Q&A, say, I'm going to come back with a few closing thoughts, but now I'm going to take your questions. And then come back and after the Q&A, spend another 5 minutes where you give that inspirational close. I'm saying 5 minutes. That would be, say, if it was a 45-minute presentation, it might be two if it was shorter, it might be one if it was shorter. But you come back and you say some follow-up comments after the Q&A to really have the final impression that people have of you being positive.
Okay, so you kind of like let the audience know this is what we're going to do. I'm going to
Yes,
take
you need
some
someone because
questions and then we're going to finish up.
it's so counter to how we so often see it that you need a plan in your audience, and you might even need to tell the event organizers if you're, say, speaking at a
Mhm.
conference or something like that, hey, after Q&A, I'm going to come back for 5 more minutes, because it's not done very often, but it can be extremely
Mm.
effective. Now, sometimes if you're,
Okay.
say, in a panel situation where there's 3 or 4 of you, you might not have the control to not end it on a Q&A, but when it's in your control, choose to come back with a real close.
Okay. See, these are all the things that like I feel like no one talks about. No one is like, "Hey, you need to have these things prepared ahead of time," because the last thing you want on top of just getting up in front of people and sharing speech, because that's nerve-wracking on its own, but you don't want to be caught in this awkward moment of, "Oh shoot, what do I do now?" Or like, "Wow, I thought this was an amazing speech," and then someone derailed it with their like dumb, irrelevant question, right? And then, it sort of like falls flat. So I love that's a great solution to be able to still have a Q&A, but stay in control of the message and that like lasting impression that you want to create. And to like, okay, if you're going to make that happen, you have to communicate with certain people, like the event organizer, to make sure that things go the way you want it to go. Um, yeah, that's insightful. So it's good to like have someone who can be like, these are the things you need to think about, because otherwise you just run into stuff. So let's see. Christina says, I write a lot more elegantly or formally than I speak. Christina, I totally relate to you. It's like a different, like you have your writing style and your speaking style. How do you overcome the feeling that you sound unintelligible by writing how you speak, and vice versa, I suppose? Um, what are your thoughts on that, Eva?
Oh, that's a
When
really
your writing
interesting
style
question.
doesn't match with like, yeah.
Yeah, when it doesn't match. Well, I would say that in general, most of us, I mean, like I was saying a moment ago, Christina, I think a lot of us can really relate to that, where our writing does tend to be more formal than our speaking. One thing to you might consider doing as you're, say, writing out something is just really going through and kind of just asking, is this clear what I'm trying to say? And am I using a $10 word when a $5 word or a $1 word would be more clear or make more sense? I am someone who often just naturally in conversation uses words like facilitated, just normal conversation. Um, or that, not that facilitated is a big word, but just meaning, we can all have these words that we lean into. So one of it is just like looking back over your writing and seeing through, okay, would I say it this way? Like if I was, and another check for that would probably be like, let's say if you were writing something, is reading it out loud, and how does it sound out loud, and maybe even reading it out loud to someone in your life and just saying, would I say it this way if I was telling the person, and what would I be changing in my writing? I'm not sure if that helps, but that would be my first thought. What about you, Lauren?
Mm.
Do you have any ideas on that one?
Yeah, well, yeah, because you and I do talk about this from time to time, and that's such a good question, Christina. Because when you're writing a speech, okay, I'll share this brief story. When I was in college, everyone had to take Speech 180. That was like the speech requirement. My speech professor, he was wonderful, but his style was a little different. We had to write out our speech in a script, word for word. And then we were expected to present our speech pretty much word for word. And it drove me bonkers. And I got a B in that class. Anyway,
Ah,
but something that you've shared before, Eve, is the idea of internalizing your speech rather than memorizing your speech. I feel like that might be, to me, that was like a game changer when you shared that. So can you talk about like what's the difference, and like how can we practice internalizing our speech rather than just trying to memorize something that we've written?
absolutely. Well, I would love to share it within a self-deprecating story. So in college, I was on the speech team, and similar to your, that public speaking 180 thing, I was on the speech team, and I had a couple, which means that I competitively went to university to university to compete on persuasive speaking and events like that. And in that season of my life, I mean, I'm 19, 20, I would memorize. I'd do exactly as your college professor suggested. I'd write it out and I'd memorize it all. So I'm at this competition, and I'm 3 minutes into a 10-minute speech, and my mind just went completely blank. Like I just couldn't remember the next thing. So I stood there for, an awkward, I don't know, 10 or 15 seconds, and like that internal panic's rising. And so I just thought, I'm going to just start over from the beginning. And so I start over from the beginning, get to the same spot, mind goes blank again. And I was like, I can't remember the next word. Like what's the next section? And of course, most scenarios now as adults, you can take up some form of notes, but at the time in college, you weren't allowed to take up notes with you. So you actually needed to know the,
Mhm.
but that to me was a wake up call. The problem with memorizing is if you forget a line, if you forget an idea, it can really derail you. And it can also come off as feeling read or a little inauthentic because it sounds like we're reading a speech. And so instead,
Mhm.
if you can learn to internalize, which is taking your, the story arc of what you're trying to say and internalizing the core big events, knowing that if you forget some pieces, no one's going to know what you didn't tell them anyway,
Mhm.
but you're going to be able to come off as a lot more authentic and natural as a communicator. And so, a few tips for internalizing. One that I feel is really underrated is on our iPhones, they all come preloaded with that voice memo app. And so after you get the content done to whatever level you've written it out, whether that's full write out or if that's talking points, delivering it into, with the help of, your sheets of paper, your computer screen, delivering exactly like you would have it into your voice memo app, and then re-listening to yourself giving it. You'd be amazed at how much more time you have to work on your project, your presentation, when you're driving in your car or you're doing dishes or you're going on a run. And listening to yourself give it can kind of help you do that internalization. If you're more or less of an auditory, I tend to be an auditory learner. If you're a little less of that, you could also consider doing, a visual design of colored post-its on the wall and taking a picture to learn it, or learning it based on your slide deck. But really, the goal truly is you don't want to memorize it. You're going to sound like a robot, or you might lose your train of thought like I did years ago. Rather, try to internalize it for the main concepts.
Mm. I really like that because then you're really, I think that probably this is just a hunch that I have. You're really thinking about what you're saying and what you're communicating rather than just like that memory recall side of your brain that you're trying to access. And so I feel like that would just help you connect with your content and your audience better too, because you're accessing like different parts of your brain. If like and it sounds like you really know what you're talking about, which we want to build that authority and not just feel like anyone can memorize something. But if you're really speaking from that sense of like, this is internalized knowledge that I'm sharing with you, that I feel like would just naturally come across like a very different way to people.
It really does. And I mean, I always say that, it's important to observe from great speakers that you like, but it's important to be yourself in your own presentation. So
Mm.
learn from them, take the things that you like, but don't try to emulate them. Try to be the best version of yourself.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's kinda like if you wanna be a better writer, you need to read books, not so you can copy their style, but you do absorb, and get good tips and like, "Oh, I like how they do that," and you can kinda, like, borrow from the best. So that's really good. Okay, this is like help Lauren out, but I know that I'm not
Okay,
alone
good.
here.
Let's do some
So,
live
yeah.
coaching. I love
So,
it.
like, for this master class that I'm doing next week, the thing that I've noticed whenever I do an online presentation is like, you don't have a clear starting point. Like when you go up on a stage, like you've shared before, don't introduce yourself and say, "Hi, my name is so and so," for those of you who don't know me. And thank you for being here. And this is what I do. And so let me start my speech, right? Like, don't do you say like don't do that. You want that first sentence to be like that hook, right? Where you start with that moment to grab their attention immediately. But when it's a webinar, just like logistically, that's kind of, I don't know if that's impossible to do, but I haven't found a good way to do that because it's like, okay, is everyone here? Should we give everyone a minute? Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, everyone, thanks for being here. And I'm like, that to me falls flat in terms of like if I were in person, I would never start like that. But how can you sort of get around that when you're on that Zoom webinar or Zoom call format so that you can make sure that people are really paying attention from the beginning and that they're engaged in listening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple things. I think one, and this can be a little bit easier said than done, but as best as you can, do try to start as close to on time as you can. I know today we had a couple technical difficulties on my end, so it wasn't like but there is that level of you're waiting for people to get there and come into the room, and sometimes we can be in that scenario where you're like watching the Zoom numbers click up, and it's like, okay, what are we doing? One way to kind of start is to truly do have a couple planned content. Like what would be like an icebreaker? Let's say it's a scenario in which multiple people can speak in the room. Maybe you could have an icebreaker that you have in the chat that you're doing. Maybe you still having that opening story. And I think a lot of it is just having that kind of enthusiasm and that confidence and that energy like you had at the beginning here, where you were saying those things, but it was kind of those introductory comments. So I wouldn't worry
Mhm.
too much about it. Although the sooner you can get into the meat of your content, the better. And it can also kind of train for future, especially for people where you're going to be doing, say, like you host a regular webinar. I mean, we've all had this experience, right? Where if you kind of like know, like a friend is, you're supposed to be meeting a friend for coffee, but you kind of know she always runs 10 to 15 minutes late. So you just sort of run 10 to 15 minutes late. But we also have
Mhm.
those friends. It's like, if you're not there, they're going to be there punctual and they're going to be on time and things are going to start on time. So as much as you can, be really consistent with starting on time and starting that video right when it goes, and then so
Mhm.
making the people that were a little late kind of feel like they missed out is actually kind of a good thing, because they'll be like, oh no, what did I miss? And then let's say you were starting with a story to launch into it, and then you realize, okay, a bunch more attendees have joined in the last few minutes. You might be able to later kind of bring them up to speed about it, or that might even kind of produce a little FOMO in them to get there earlier on time, and or
Mhm.
watch the replay later.
Okay, that's good. So don't let the stragglers sort of dictate the way
Don't
that
let the
you
stragglers
continue
dictate. Maybe
moving
give
through
a
the
couple minutes, like you
presentation.
said, a couple grace minutes,
Mhm.
or 2 to 5,
Mhm.
depending on what the circumstances is. Obviously, if you're giving a business presentation to stakeholders, that might be a little different scenario than if you're doing
Sure.
a webinar like this. So again, knowing your audience and the context, but that would be, don't let your content be dictated in the stragglers. In the same way, don't let the end of your talk be dictated by the last person to ask the question.
Okay, and then just, like, come at it with just, like, energy, hey, this is like people want to know they're in the right place, so they like click the right link. I think like
Yes.
this is what we're doing. Welcome, and it's like go. Don't like kind of delay and have a lot of just like filler time before you just get right into your content. Is what it sounds like.
Yes, that's my suggestion.
Okay, I think that's perfect. I think that makes a lot of sense. That's very helpful to me. Thank you.
Yeah, and well, now I want to see how next week goes,
Yeah.
and how that happens.
Oh, I'm so excited about it. I was writing and like thinking, keeping your advice in mind of like how internalizing, not writing out a script, but I was getting so pumped for it. So yeah, I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. What last words of wisdom? What would you say are just the things that like if you want to just really quickly step up their game, or get more confidence to speak and just really take their speaking to the next level, what are just like your biggest tips for them?
I would say get as many reps as you can. The more times you do something, the better at you become. A lot of times, we wait for opportunities instead of creating our own, whether it's, creating your own podcast or webinar or being a guest on
Mm.
someone else's show. But I would say, one of the biggest ways to improve is to start getting reps in regularly. And even subtly trying out pieces of content that you might think might work in a presentation later on, in a smaller group. So, try that funny story out at a dinner party, or try that example out, with your spouse. And then another thing I encourage every single person to do is to keep a story file and to keep a humor file. A lot of times when it comes to preparing the content, we start trying to rack our brain for, well, I should open with a story, but what story? But if you start just kind of intentionally paying a little bit of attention to your life, of writing little anecdotes down as they happen, one-liners that are going to trigger memory. Same with humor. As funny things happen, as you find yourself laughing, as everybody laughs at work about something, just jotting a little bit of a note. And if you stick with that for several months, then down the line, anytime you have to give a presentation, you can just glance and go, oh, I could pick this story, I could pick that story, or I could pick that quote. And then having a system for what you read as well. So as you're reading and you see an inspirational quote, or you see a story in a book that you like, having some way of marking it and knowing you can come back to it. Because a lot of times just on our content creation, our mind kind of goes blank and then it goes off the races of all the things we could say, but just kind of having that level of clarity. So I would definitely say start just practicing now and getting in those reps as much as you can, and then having a system for just kind of cataloging stories and experiences as they happen. And especially for business owners, really be gathering customers and clients' stories that you can use later on in your own
Mm.
presentations, and making sure that you have a system. If you get a great email of somebody who appreciated your product, making the effort to like get back in touch with them to get a little bit more of the story, a little bit more of the context that you can maybe then use later on in your own content.
Yeah, I love that because it's daunting enough to go, okay, I have to prepare a piece, but if you have a whole list of different stories and quotes and things that you can pull from, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. Like you probably have a lot of your content already there and just need to organize it. And something that I just want to add, if you don't mind, to what you said about
Yeah.
gathering those customer stories. Um, I used to not do this, and now I do, and I think it's made a huge difference. Is that you don't only want to get like the results and like their good testimonials. It's very important. But really, if you do a consultation or they come into you and ask questions, what questions are they asking? What words are they using when they're talking about what's the problem that you're going to help them solve? Um, what's kind of the backstory to why they're reaching out to you? And those can be
Mhm.
really powerful things, I think, to include as well, like the before as well as the after.
Yeah, that's great.
So,
And people love hearing those transformational stories.
mhm.
If I was there and then after using the product or the service was there. That's a great suggestion of really listening to what they're saying.
Mm. Well, Eva, this has been so valuable. Like I feel like, just taking even one or two things that you've shared today and implementing that in our speaking is going to just elevate it to that next level. So thank you for sharing so much of your experience your wisdom with us today. I do have your link to where you can get her free guide. It's 12 acts, 12 questions you must ask for a killer speech. It's at thespeakshop.com, and you just put your email in there and she'll send it over to you. But I've read it. Like, it is so jam-packed with even more than what we even had time to cover today. So it's pure gold. So make sure that you grab that. And Eva, how can people connect with you?
Yeah, well, send me a request on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's really one of the big ways we got connected in general, you and I at first. And so I'm very active on LinkedIn. I really try to post speech related content Monday through Friday mornings, and then you'll get lots of random other entrepreneurship or book reading or family life on evenings and weekends. But I really try to stay focused on speech content Monday through Friday mornings. And so look for me on
Awesome.
LinkedIn.
Perfect. Yes. Find Eva on LinkedIn. Make sure to grab that free guide. It's seriously excellent and wonderful. Well, you guys have a great rest of your week. Eva, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.